A young girl from a quiet snow-brush town in Idaho left for school one crisp morning and never came back, vanishing without a trace. Her absence shattered her parents' lives, plunging them into a sea of grief and unanswered questions that stretched endlessly. But 2 years later, a moment of eerie discovery arrived, when her mother zoomed in on Google Maps and saw something that stopped her breath. It was a peaceful Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sun glows softly through curtains and time seems to slow. In a modest Airbnb tucked away in a leafy New York suburb, sunlight filtered gently through pale cream drapes, casting elongated golden rectangles on the wooden floor. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator and distant city traffic muffled by double-paned windows. Rachel Warren sat on a sagging sofa in the center of the room, her laptop balanced on the coffee table before her. The travel fatigue clung to her like a second skin. At 36, Rachel wore exhaustion like armor. Her spine was stiff, her hands clasped too tightly, her shoulders hunched with the weight of 2 long years spent searching. It was as if her body hadn't remembered how to breathe since the day everything fell apart. "Yes, we've just arrived in New York," said her husband, Daniel, his voice low as he paced the short distance across the compact living space. He spoke into his phone with the practiced tone of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. At 39, Daniel's youthful spark had dulled. Deep furrows carved themselves into his brow, and his temples were streaked with gray. The past 2 years had aged him brutally. "We're ready to begin the investigation," he continued, glancing at Rachel. "Yes, we can be at the station this afternoon." Rachel barely registered her husband's voice. Her focus was locked on the screen before her. She typed in the address he had just repeated, watching Google Maps load the route from their Airbnb to the nearby precinct. Her eyes traced the familiar blue line while her mind wandered through a landscape of memories and dread. "They'll be expecting us in about an hour," Daniel said, ending the call. He raked his fingers through his thick graying hair with a tired sigh. "I'm just trying to get a feel for the area," Rachel murmured, eyes still on the screen. She zoomed in and out with delicate swipes of her fingers. New York was alien to them. Their life had been rooted in Pine Hollow, a close-knit town nestled in Idaho's vast, forested silence. A place where neighbors greeted each other by name and children could walk to school unaccompanied. Tragedies like this didn't happen there. Until they did. 2 years earlier, their daughter Eugene had disappeared without warning. She had just left a baptism class at their small local church. Witnesses last saw her walking across the street with friends heading toward their usual meeting spot at the corner playground. She never made it home. That moment cleaved their lives into 2 halves, before and after. The days that followed had devoured them. They launched community searches, fielded press inquiries, printed flyers, and answered late-night calls from strangers who thought they had seen her. Their marriage frayed beneath the strain. Their faith faltered. The certainty that had once governed their world was replaced with a slow-burning chaos. Rachel now scanned the digital map of New York like a general studying a battlefield. They had chosen this Airbnb for its proximity to Bryant Park, a detail that had grown urgent in light of a recent tip. "The caller was very specific," she said softly, more to herself than to Daniel. "They said they saw a girl who matched Eugene's description at a homeless outreach event near Bryant Park." It was the first lead in months that felt even remotely plausible. Every other tip had turned out to be a dead end, each one lifting their hopes before crushing them again. But this one held a strange weight. Detailed, timely, geographically anchored. Enough to justify a cross-country flight and another plunge into uncertainty. Rachel dragged her cursor across the digital landscape, her eyes lingering on the intricate layout surrounding the park. Small buildings filled the screen, punctuated with steeples and crosses. Churches. Lots of them. "There are a lot of churches here," she said, with a faint breath of relief. "I was worried I wouldn't be able to attend service while we're here." Daniel, now at the kitchen counter unpacking his toiletry bag, nodded distantly. She understood his silence. Before Eugene's disappearance, Daniel had been a devout man, steadfast in his beliefs, a leader in their congregation. But after the tragedy, his faith cracked. The church had become a place filled with too many eyes, too many hollow words. He had stepped back. Rachel, however, had stepped forward. She'd taken refuge in ritual and routine, working in church administration back home, pouring herself into prayer even as doubts clawed at the edges of her belief. "I've booked us for 2 weeks," Rachel added, "but we can extend it if needed." Daniel returned to the couch and sat beside her, the cushion dipping under his weight. "Let me see what you've found." Rachel turned the laptop toward him, pointing out the police department's location, the park, and the cluster of churches. "I think we have a solid place to start," she said. "Let's look at Street View," Daniel suggested, taking the touchpad. "I want to see what this Bryant Park looks like." Rachel leaned in as he dragged the little blue figure across the screen. The view transformed into real-world imagery: trees, sidewalks, benches, traffic, all frozen in time by Google's camera cars. They began by examining the community park, then branched out to nearby streets. "That's Mole Street," Rachel said, recognizing the sign as they panned toward a residential stretch. At the far end stood a small church, white-walled and modest, its entrance framed by ivy-covered stone. Daniel zoomed in. And that's when Rachel saw it. A girl in a pink hoodie was walking alongside a man. Both had their backs to the camera car. "Daniel," her voice trembled as she pointed to the screen, "look." The hoodie. It was soft pink with a delicate stitched pattern on the back, stars in a faint arc. It was the same hoodie Eugene had worn the day she vanished. Rachel had picked it out for her daughter's 11th birthday, just 3 weeks before that fateful day. She knew every thread of it. "Honey, turn it," she urged, her heart now pounding. "See if we can catch their faces." Daniel tried to rotate the view, flipping to adjacent angles, but each image was blurred. Google's standard privacy protocol. The figures appeared only in fragments, always from the side or back. No faces, no clarity. "Something about that man feels familiar," Rachel whispered, her eyes fixed on the screen. Daniel exhaled, sagging back against the sofa cushions. "Rachel, this is the 100th time you've seen a girl in a pink hoodie. You've become obsessed with that outfit." She didn't argue. "But I know how badly you want to find her," he added gently. "I do too. But we can't chase every pink sweater." Rachel nodded slowly. Still, she dropped pins on each significant spot: the church, the park, the exact location of the sighting. She closed the laptop with trembling fingers. Daniel was probably right. But her instincts whispered otherwise. They had to stay methodical, structured, not impulsive. Every step needed to be deliberate, grounded in reason, not emotion. They had a plan, and it mattered now more than ever. "We should go," Daniel said, rising from the couch with a new sense of urgency. "Let's not waste any more daylight. First stop, the police station. We'll speak to the officers, get clearance to post the missing person flyers, and then head to Bryant Park with someone from the department." Rachel nodded and moved toward their luggage. Inside a side pouch of her suitcase was a thick stack of flyers, freshly printed and still warm when she had packed them. Each page bore the same heart-wrenching image: Eugene's youthful smile, her sparkling eyes, and the soft cascade of her long hair. Below were the vital details of her disappearance. Distributing these had become a ritual for Rachel. 2 years of tacking them onto bulletin boards, taping them to telephone poles, and handing them to strangers had carved a groove of pain into her soul. But she had never stopped. She couldn't stop. Not now. They left the apartment and stepped into the soft hush of late afternoon. The New York air carried the faint scent of warmed pavement and distant street food. Rachel drove, the GPS glowing on her phone screen, guiding them through the unfamiliar maze of city streets. Daniel sat beside her, thumbing through the case notes they'd compiled, statements, timelines, photos, his brow furrowed with concentration. "Turn right at the next light," the robotic voice instructed calmly. As they rolled toward the intersection, Rachel's eyes widened. She slowed the car, pointing through the windshield. "Look," she said quietly. "That's Bryant Park. From the tip." The park was alive despite the hour. Laughter floated through the air. Children dashed across the grass. Couples strolled hand in hand beneath the shadow of tall trees. Near a gazebo, a small crowd had formed, gathered around what might have been an outreach event, just like the caller described. Rachel's fingers twitched on the wheel, the instinct to stop almost overpowering. Her breath caught in her chest. She wanted to jump out of the car, run into the crowd and scan every face, shout her daughter's name until someone turned, until Eugene turned. "We'll come back later," Daniel said gently, sensing the storm in her heart. "Without backup, it's no use. We need trained eyes with us." Rachel reluctantly nodded and drove on, but then something caught her attention. A street sign ahead, stark white letters on a green background. Mole Street. Without thinking, she flicked on the turn signal and steered the car down the narrow lane. "What are you doing?" Daniel asked, his voice sharp with confusion. "This isn't the way to the station." Rachel's eyes stayed on the road. "I just want to see the church from Google Maps, just for a minute." "Rachel, I need to pray," she said, her tone soft but unwavering. Daniel exhaled, leaning back against the headrest, frustration edging into his voice. "There won't be a service right now. We're wasting precious time. You can pray in the car. God will hear you. He doesn't need a building." His voice, tinged with bitterness, stabbed at her. "You know that doctrine well enough." Rachel didn't respond. Her eyes roamed the sidewalks, searching for a sign, a shape, a flash of pink, anything. "You just wanted to check this street," Daniel said flatly, not asking but knowing, "to see if that girl was there." "I know," Rachel admitted in a whisper. "I know it's just satellite images, but I had to follow this feeling. I had to respond." Daniel studied her profile. That determined set of her jaw, he'd seen it 1,000 times. It was a look she wore whenever hope dared to show its face again. He knew better than to argue when she looked like that. Sometimes she just needed to act on instinct. The church came into view, a small, humble brick building with a white cross perched above the arched entryway. The lot was nearly empty, save for a few scattered leaves and a single parked bicycle. Rachel pulled in and turned off the engine. "I'll wait out here," Daniel said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I need some air. I'll also call the station and let them know we'll be late." Rachel watched him step outside, his tall frame silhouetted against the sky. He looked older now, shoulders stooped by sorrow. They used to move in sync, a perfect rhythm of support and trust. But now grief had changed them, fractured their togetherness. Sometimes they felt like strangers who only shared tragedy in common. She took her purse and retrieved the small Bible she always carried, its leather cover worn smooth with age. Eugene's name was embossed on the front, a birthday gift from years past. The pages were soft from daily reading, tear-stained from countless nights spent praying into their spine. As Rachel approached the church's double doors, a strange mix of nervousness and certainty filled her chest. She couldn't explain what had pulled her here. Maybe divine nudging. Maybe a mother's intuition. Whatever it was, she wouldn't ignore it. She pushed open the wooden door, its hinges groaning slightly. Inside, the air was cool and still, filled with the subtle perfume of melted wax and polished pews. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting hues of blue and gold across the aisle. For a moment, Rachel stood frozen. It felt like stepping into a memory, peaceful and haunting all at once. She let her eyes adjust to the dim sanctuary, heart fluttering. A man stood near the front, wiping down pews with slow, practiced strokes, middle-aged, dressed casually. He didn't notice her at first. Rachel stepped forward, her shoes tapping softly on the tile. "Excuse me," she said gently. He looked up and smiled warmly. "Hello there, can I help you?" "I hope so," she replied, retrieving her phone. "I'm looking for information about a man and a girl I saw in this neighborhood. I know this might sound strange." She opened her Save Street View image and handed him the phone. "This isn't very clear, but I wondered if you might recognize them." The man adjusted his glasses, squinting at the screen. He studied the blurry outlines of the girl in the pink hoodie and the taller figure beside her, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's hard to tell with the blurring," he said after a long pause, "but something about them does seem familiar." He handed the phone back to her with a thoughtful expression. "Are they friends of yours?" Rachel hesitated, her throat tightening. "No, the girl, I think she might be my daughter. She's been missing for 2 years." The words hung heavy between them, and for a moment neither spoke. "I'm so sorry," he said gently, genuine sorrow in his eyes. That's unimaginable." Rachel gave a tight nod, her fingers clutching the phone as though it anchored her in place. The sanctuary, with its quiet and filtered light, suddenly felt like a confessional, where strangers met only to share burdens too heavy for the world outside. Outside, sunlight was beginning to drift lower in the sky, painting the window panes with deep amber. Long shadows crept slowly across the floor, bending around the edges of pews like silent sentinels. Rachel sat in one of the front rows, just for a moment. She needed to breathe. She needed to be still. The silence pressed in on her, but not unkindly. It was the silence of old churches, heavy with memory and meaning. She closed her eyes and whispered a quiet prayer, not just for Eugene, but for strength, for clarity, for a sign that this aching trail might finally lead somewhere real. Behind her, the man returned to his cleaning, offering her space without question. Rachel glanced once more at the photo on her phone. Just a blur, but to her it was everything. A memory, a possibility, and possibly the beginning of the end of their nightmare. The staff member leaned in closer, narrowing his eyes at the grainy image on Rachel's phone. The figures, distorted and partially blurred by Google Maps' automated filters, were hard to make out. Still, his brow tightened in concentration as he studied the scene. "It's difficult to say for sure," he murmured after a few seconds. "The blurring makes it tough, but something about them does look kind of familiar." He handed the phone back to Rachel, curiosity etched into the lines around his eyes. "Are they friends of yours?" Rachel hesitated. Her instinct was to guard the truth, to share only what was necessary. But after a moment, she exhaled slowly. "No. I'm trying to find my daughter," she admitted, her voice low and steady. "She disappeared 2 years ago. Every lead, no matter how small, I have to follow." The man's expression softened immediately. "I'm so sorry to hear that," he said, his tone thick with genuine sympathy. "I can't imagine what you've been through." But before he could say more, the heavy wooden door to a back office creaked open. Rachel turned toward the sound as 2 men stepped out into the sanctuary. They were mid-conversation, speaking in low tones, both dressed in black suits and white clerical collars, the unmistakable attire of Protestant clergy. One wore a formal robe, the other a tailored suit. Rachel's breath caught as her eyes locked onto the second man. There was something about him, his posture, the shape of his face, that tugged violently at her memory. "Thank you for your help," Rachel said quickly to the staff member, then stepped away and approached the 2 clergymen. The older man in the formal robe paused as she neared and offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "Can I help you?" "Yes, hello," Rachel replied, extending her hand with a soft smile. "I was just admiring your beautiful church." "I'm Pastor Graham," he introduced himself, taking her hand in a firm but gentle shake. "I serve as senior pastor here, and this is Evangelist Matthew, who's been guest preaching with us for the last couple of weeks." "Evangelist Matthew," Rachel echoed, her voice catching slightly. The man looked at her, his expression momentarily blank. Then a flicker of confusion crossed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "Have we met?" Rachel stepped closer, her heart thudding in her chest. "Yes, I believe we have. I'm Rachel Warren from Pine Hollow, Idaho. I work at First Protestant Church there. A few years ago, we invited you to preach for our Sunday service." His brow furrowed slightly, as if reaching into a distant memory. "And arranged your accommodations, coordinated your arrival," she continued, hoping to jog his memory. "You led our prayer group. There was an altar call. You prayed over a woman in a wheelchair. She stood up and walked. It was remarkable. The whole congregation talked about it for months." Recognition flickered in his eyes, either real or expertly conjured. "Ah, yes," he said suddenly, smiling widely. "Rachel Warren, of course. That was such a blessed service. I remember now. The Lord works in mysterious ways, doesn't he?" Rachel smiled back, but inside, something was tightening. "I meet so many people at so many churches," he continued. "Sometimes the faces of those assisting blend together, but I never forget a true healing." She nodded, understanding. A traveling evangelist like him must see thousands of faces each year. "It's nice to see you again," she said. "Are you serving here permanently?" "No, just passing through," he replied easily. "This is my final day, actually. I'll be preaching at the evening service and flying out tonight to continue my church tour." "What an incredible coincidence," Rachel said, though deep in her chest she wasn't sure it was a coincidence at all. Perhaps this was why she'd felt so compelled to stop here. Perhaps her instincts were being guided by something greater. "Indeed," Matthew agreed. "And what brings you to New York, all the way from Idaho?" Rachel's smile faltered. Her hand dipped into her bag, and she pulled out one of the posters, unfolding it carefully. "My daughter," she said quietly. "Eugene. She went missing shortly after your visit to Pine Hollow." She handed him the flyer. It trembled slightly in her grip. "We got a tip that someone saw a girl matching her description near Bryant Park. My husband and I came immediately." Matthew took the flyer, and for a moment his expression froze. His eyes lingered on the image. Eugene's beaming smile, those innocent eyes. There was the faintest shift in his stance, a stiffening, almost imperceptible. Rachel saw it, felt it. Was she imagining things? Pastor Graham stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her arm. "What a heartbreaking ordeal," he said kindly. "Let us pray together, for her safety, for your strength." The three formed a small circle. Pastor Graham took Rachel's hand. Evangelist Matthew joined a beat later, his grip firm and warm. Graham's voice rose softly in prayer, asking for divine guidance and protection. Rachel bowed her head, her eyes stinging. When the prayer ended, Matthew stepped forward and pulled her into a hug. At first, it felt kind, appropriate, comforting. But then it lingered, tightened. His hand on her back pressed firmly, not in comfort, but as if anchoring her. Rachel's breath caught. She felt him inhale deeply near her ear. It was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Too intimate, too strange. She pulled back slightly. He let go, reluctantly. Something in his eyes had changed. Then, as he adjusted his jacket, Rachel caught a glimpse of something in his breast pocket. A folded photo, half slipped into the lining. The image was turned inward, but the paper was thin, and in that second, Rachel's heart lurched. It looked like the outline of a young girl. Her mouth went dry. Matthew's hand darted to the pocket, tucking the photo in deeper. "A photo of my daughter," he said quickly, smoothly. "I carry it with me everywhere. She's always in my thoughts." Rachel forced a smile, though her stomach twisted. That silhouette, it was so familiar. Pastor Graham stepped forward again. "We'll mention your daughter at tonight's service," he promised. "Many eyes searching are better than just two." "Thank you," Rachel said, recovering her composure. "That means a great deal." She began gathering her things, tucking the poster back into her bag. "My husband is waiting," she added. "We need to get to the police station." As she turned to leave, a cold feeling washed over her. Her steps quickened, her heartbeat unsteady. Something about Matthew's reaction, the awkward hug, the breath too close, the photograph, left a jagged edge in her mind. Surely she was being paranoid. Surely this was just a man of God, a man respected in congregations across the country. Still, as she walked into the warm sunlight, the church door closing behind her, Rachel felt a chill rise up her spine that had nothing to do with the indoor air. Her thoughts churned as she crossed the parking lot. What if this wasn't a coincidence? What if the trail had just become terrifyingly real? As Rachel reached the car, Daniel looked up from his phone. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow creased with concern. Rachel opened the door slowly and slid into the driver's seat, her mind still spinning. "I think so," she said, but her voice was hollow. The engine purred to life, but she didn't pull away immediately. Her hands rested on the wheel, motionless. Daniel studied her face. What happened? Rachel stared out the windshield at the modest church front. "I spoke to someone. 2 pastors, actually. One of them was someone I knew, or thought I knew. And I don't know. Something about him didn't feel right." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did he say anything suspicious?" She admitted. "Not exactly. But it was how he acted, like he recognized Eugene's picture, but didn't want to. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, the breeze rustled the branches of a nearby tree, scattering leaves across the pavement. Rachel finally shifted into gear. "Let's go to the police." As they drove away, the small church shrank in the rearview mirror. But the feeling that had gripped Rachel inside its walls clung to her still. An intuition sharp as a blade. And this time, she knew better than to ignore it. The unease that had taken root inside Rachel couldn't be shaken off with logic or calm reasoning. It clung to her, persistent and sharp, no matter how implausible it might sound to others. To Daniel, especially. As she stepped out into the afternoon sun, the air felt too warm, too heavy. Her eyes quickly found Daniel, seated in the rental car parked at the curb. The driver's side door was ajar, propped open to let in the soft breeze. His posture was stiff, arms braced against the wheel, and the tension in his brow made it clear he'd been waiting with little patience. "What took you so long?" Daniel snapped the moment she approached. His voice was low but laced with frustration. "You've wasted 30 minutes on this detour. The police are expecting us." Rachel slid into the driver's seat, but didn't close the door. She turned to him, her voice low and urgent. "Daniel, you won't believe who I just saw inside. Evangelist Matthew. The same one who preached at our church in Pine Hollow, right before Eugene went missing." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "So?" "There's something off about him," she insisted, glancing out the window as if expecting someone to overhear. "When he hugged me, he held on too long. It wasn't comforting. It was invasive. And he smelled me. I swear he did. Not just a regular hug. It was like he was trying to memorize me." Daniel's skeptical look deepened, but she pressed on, more urgently now. "And he had a photograph in his pocket. I only saw it for a second, but the silhouette, it looked like Eugene. I know it's a stretch, but I recognized her profile. I swear." "Rachel?" Daniel's tone was cautious, clearly bracing to contradict her. "I know how it sounds," she interrupted, her voice cracking slightly. "But I'm not imagining this. When I showed him Eugene's picture, he hesitated. His whole demeanor shifted. He looked startled." Daniel's expression shifted subtly, softening with the weight of her conviction. He looked down at his hands, folded tensely in his lap. "We've served in churches together for years," he said slowly. "Evangelists like Matthew. They're respected, trusted. If what you're saying is true, it would shock a lot of people. We need to be absolutely certain before we accuse anyone. That kind of accusation could ruin lives." "I'm not accusing anyone," Rachel clarified quickly. "I'm just saying something doesn't feel right." Daniel let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. He was caught between two roles, the logical partner trying to keep them on track, and the grieving father torn by hope and caution. "Let's go to the police station like we planned," he said finally. "They're expecting us. We can explain everything there. If there's any weight to your suspicions, they'll know how to handle it." Rachel nodded slowly. "You're right, and with the police involved, we can always get Pastor Graham to provide Matthew's contact info if we need it." But before they could close the doors and pull away, the church doors opened behind them. Evangelist Matthew stepped out, still dressed in his tailored suit, his demeanor calm and pleasant. He smiled, waved goodbye to Pastor Graham, and turned toward the parking lot. Then he spotted them, Rachel and Daniel. He lifted a hand and gave them a friendly wave as he strolled toward his car, which was parked just 2 spaces down from theirs. Rachel stiffened as he approached. When Matthew opened his car door, a rush of air escaped from the vehicle's interior, and with it came a scent so distinct, so personal, that it sent chills racing down her spine. Vanilla. Not just any vanilla, but a soft, warm fragrance laced with floral undertones. Eugene's favorite perfume. The one Rachel had given her for Christmas the year before she'd vanished. Eugene had worn it nearly every day, calling it her grown-up scent. Rachel's stomach dropped. Her fingers clutched the edge of her seat. It couldn't be a coincidence. Matthew climbed into his car and reversed out of the space, giving them another casual wave as he pulled away. He had no idea, Rachel thought, that he had just confirmed her worst suspicion. "Get in the car, Daniel," she said sharply, already reaching for the keys. Her tone brooked no argument. "Close the door." Daniel did as told, startled. "What is it?" "Didn't you smell that?" Rachel's voice trembled, though her hands were steady on the wheel. "Smell what?" When he opened his door, vanilla, Eugene's perfume. Daniel blinked. "Rachel? Come on. Vanilla's one of the most common scents out there. It could be his daughter's perfume, or his wife's, or even a cheap air freshener." Rachel turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming to life. "No, it wasn't generic. I'd know it anywhere. I picked it out myself. She loved it." Daniel shook his head. "You're connecting dots that might not exist." "I feel a call in my heart about this," Rachel said firmly. "A strong one. I need to follow it." "And go where?" Daniel asked, exasperated. "Chase after a respected evangelist based on a hug and a smell?" "I just need to confirm it," Rachel said. If I'm wrong, we'll go straight to the station and forget it ever happened, but I can't let this go, not yet." Daniel threw up his hands. "You're spiritualizing this, Rachel. This is exactly how people get led astray. We can't go chasing calls and gut feelings instead of facts." The words stung, especially coming from him. "I'm not claiming divine prophecy," she said tightly. "I'm a mother, and I've worked around enough ministers to know when something's not adding up." Daniel sighed and turned away, his posture rigid as he stared out the window. "Fine," he muttered, "do whatever you want. But don't say I didn't warn you when this ends in embarrassment." The silence in the car grew heavy as Rachel pulled out of the lot and turned onto Mole Street, heading in the direction Matthew had gone. Her heart pounded, a steady drum of doubt and determination. Was she chasing shadows? Or was she on the verge of uncovering the truth? She didn't know. But she couldn't ignore the instinct that had gripped her so tightly. A mother's intuition didn't play by the rules of reason. Rachel kept a safe distance as they followed Matthew's car through the winding suburban streets. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows across the road. Every turn felt weighted, every intersection a test of her resolve. Daniel sat beside her in brooding silence, arms crossed, tension rolling off him in waves. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "We can't call the police because we have nothing, just your gut and a scent. We're wasting valuable time." "Just bear with me," Rachel said quietly, her eyes never leaving the road. "If I'm wrong, I promise I'll never do something like this again." Outside the car, the streets blurred past in streaks of fading sunlight, the late afternoon casting everything in gold. The city was slowing down, families heading home, shops pulling in sidewalk signs, the world winding toward evening. Rachel's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. Every nerve in her body buzzed with tension. She didn't dare blink too long or look away from the taillights ahead. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, tense jaw, face drawn from too many sleepless nights. She barely recognized herself anymore. But the determination burning behind those eyes was unmistakable. She had no hard evidence, no witness, no confession. Just a moment, a scent, a memory. And yet she believed it might be enough. Daniel sat rigid beside her, his silence louder than any argument. The air between them was thick, like a room with too little oxygen. He didn't believe her, not really, and yet he hadn't stopped her either. He was here. That had to mean something. Rachel swallowed hard and pressed her foot lightly on the gas. The chase, cautious and uncertain, continued. One way or another, the truth was out there, and she would not let it pass her by. They trailed the car into a neighborhood noticeably different from the one where their modest Airbnb sat. The houses here stood taller and farther apart, adorned with manicured lawns, lush flower beds, and winding stone paths leading up to wide front porches. This was an area marked by quiet affluence, a place where the streets were lined with old trees and time seemed to pass more slowly. Eventually, the evangelist's car pulled into the driveway of a stately two-story home. The white siding gleamed in the late-day sun, and the neatly trimmed hedges framed a small but vibrant garden. A wooden Airbnb sign staked into the front yard confirmed it wasn't a permanent residence. Rachel slowed the car and cruised past, eyes fixed on the house, then pulled around the corner to park on a shaded stretch of curb. From here they had a clear line of sight, but wouldn't draw attention. She turned off the engine, and the hum of the car died, leaving a tense silence in its place. "Now what?" Daniel asked. His voice was tight, his tone weary. "Now we watch," Rachel said quietly, as though speaking louder might betray their presence. Evangelist Matthew exited his vehicle and strolled to the front door, unlocking it and stepping inside without looking back. The door shut behind him with a quiet finality. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. They sat motionless, the weight of unspoken words pressing between them. The hum of distant traffic and the soft rustle of wind through trees were the only sounds. Then, just when Rachel began to wonder if they were waiting for nothing, the door opened once more. A woman stepped out, her arms full of two large suitcases. She carried them with efficiency, her dark hair pulled into a sleek bun, her blouse tucked neatly into tailored pants. She looked composed, professional. She loaded the suitcases into the trunk of Matthew's car, then disappeared back into the house. Moments later, she returned with a smaller suitcase, child-sized. Rachel leaned forward slightly, her breath catching in her throat. "Said he was leaving New York after tonight's service," she whispered, as if the woman could somehow hear her from this distance. "Why is she packing already?" The woman stepped back inside again and this time re-emerged with a child. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, stepped carefully onto the front step. Her blonde hair was parted neatly and braided into 2 pigtails tied with soft ribbons. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat as Evangelist Matthew appeared behind them. He crouched slightly to receive a kiss on the cheek from the girl, then returned her hug with a short squeeze. He smiled, waving as the girl walked toward the car with the woman. Rachel strained to see the child's face, her eyes darting from the girl's walk to her hair to the shape of her shoulders. She searched desperately for something familiar, but the more she looked, the more reality settled in. It wasn't Eugene. The face was all wrong. The hair, while similar, was too pale. The girl's frame was much smaller, far too small for someone who had once been an 11-year-old and had now spent 2 years growing out of childhood. Daniel exhaled beside her, quiet but firm. "That's his daughter, just like he said." Rachel's shoulders slumped. Her certainty, so fierce only an hour ago, crumpled like paper in a tight fist. The tension that had braced her body gave way to exhaustion. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Tears pricked behind her eyes. "I really thought... I was so sure." Daniel softened, reaching across the console to lay a gentle hand on her arm. "You're a mother," he said simply. "Any mother would do the same." Rachel nodded, unable to speak as she fought to hold herself together. Had she imagined it all? The photograph? The scent of vanilla? Were these not clues, but the desperate projections of a grieving mother aching for answers? "Let's switch," Daniel said after a pause. "I'll drive us to the station." They stepped out of the car, Rachel slowly making her way to the passenger side, her limbs heavy with defeat. As she sank into the seat, she stared blankly ahead, her mind still replaying every second of the encounter. Daniel started the car but paused, glancing down at the console. "Rachel, I need you to set Google Maps to the police station. I don't know where we are anymore." She pulled out her phone with stiff fingers and typed in the address. The familiar blue line painted a path back through the neighborhood toward their original destination. As they drove away, Rachel kept her gaze locked on the evangelist's house until it disappeared behind a bend in the road. Her gut churned. Something still didn't feel right, but her hands were empty now, and the trail had gone cold. She rested her head against the cool glass of the window, watching the quiet neighborhood give way to the busier streets of the city. 2 years of chasing rumors and second-hand sightings, of leaning into hope only to be met with silence. The world had grown used to Eugene's absence. Friends had stopped asking. Relatives offered hollow comfort. But Rachel hadn't stopped looking. She never would. Because somewhere, in the shadowy space between grief and belief, a mother's heart continued to beat with hope. As they re-entered the city, Rachel glanced at the road ahead and suddenly sat up straighter. "Look," she said, pointing. "They're turning." Daniel glanced over just in time to see the other car turning into a small parking area beside a playground. A low iron fence surrounded a stretch of grass, playground equipment, and what looked like a cafe attached to the side. "Daniel, slow down," Rachel urged, eyes locked on the playground. "I want to see where they're going." "No," Daniel said, his tone final. He pressed the gas. "No more detours. We're late already." Rachel twisted in her seat, trying to keep the car in view. She saw the woman greeting another adult by the cafe entrance. The little girl skipping toward a cluster of other children near a picnic table. The woman appeared to be dropping the child off. Then it was out of sight, the moment gone. Rachel slumped back in her seat, her hands resting in her lap. The hope that had begun to rise again vanished like a breath on glass. "I'm sorry," she murmured again. Daniel didn't look at her. His grip tightened on the wheel. "No," he said flatly. "We need to learn from this. Gut feelings aren't facts. They're dangerous. They make us see connections that aren't there." Rachel said nothing. She knew he was right. But something inside her, a whisper, a sensation, a stirring, still told her that they had missed something. Something small, something important. She closed her eyes briefly and breathed in slowly. The search wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, the sun dipped lower behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalks and bathing the tops of trees in warm amber light. The city was shifting into its evening rhythm, more foot traffic, glowing signs flickering to life, the hum of approaching nightfall. Inside the car, the mood remained somber. Rachel leaned her head back and closed her eyes, listening to the engine's steady purr and the faint murmur of a radio in another passing car. She couldn't shake the sensation that they were on the edge of something, close to a truth hidden just beneath the surface. But for now, she had to let it go. The scent, the photo, the instincts, they weren't enough to stop someone. Not yet. But she was watching. And if there was anything left to discover about Evangelist Matthew, she would find it. Not because she wanted to prove Daniel wrong, but because Eugene still mattered. And she wasn't done looking. The faint scent of vanilla, the photograph tucked into his pocket, the loaded suitcases, each piece pulsed in Rachel's mind like puzzle fragments begging to be assembled. These weren't coincidences. They couldn't be. But without tangible proof, something that could stand up to scrutiny in the eyes of the police or even Daniel, she had nothing more than intuition. And for now, that wasn't enough. They continued the drive in silence, the atmosphere inside the car thick with unspoken tension. The only sounds came from the hum of the tires over asphalt and the occasional soft voice of the GPS announcing each turn. It was several minutes before Daniel finally broke the quiet. "I know how badly you want to find her," he said, his voice gentler now, though still tired. "I do too, but we have to do this the right way, methodically, with the authorities on our side." "I know," Rachel whispered, not looking at him. Her eyes were glued to the window, watching unfamiliar buildings pass in a blur. By the time they reached the police station, nearly an hour had passed since their original appointment time. The sun had risen higher, bathing the precinct's glass facade in sharp white light. They stepped inside and approached the front desk, the din of phones ringing and voices raised in conversation echoing through the lobby. "We had an appointment with Detective Morris," Daniel said to the officer behind the desk. "Regarding our missing daughter, Eugene Warren. I'm afraid we're a bit late." The officer checked his computer, tapping in a few commands, then looked up with a sympathetic expression. "I'm sorry, but Detective Morris is in another meeting right now. He had to move on when you didn't show." Daniel's jaw tightened as he glanced sideways at Rachel. She lowered her gaze, already feeling the weight of his disappointment. "How long until he's available?" Daniel asked. "Could be a couple half hours," the officer replied. "You're welcome to wait in the lobby, or come back later." Daniel thanked the officer, then guided Rachel back outside. His frustration radiated through the stiffness of his shoulders. "See what happens when we waste time," he said under his breath once they were outside. Rachel nodded without protest. "I'm sorry, Daniel. Truly." Her sincerity softened his expression slightly. He exhaled slowly. "The officer said there's a diner nearby. I haven't eaten since breakfast. I'm guessing you haven't either." "You go ahead," Rachel offered. "I think I need to walk around a bit, clear my head. There are some interesting buildings around here. I'll be safe." Daniel hesitated, clearly unsure. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Take your phone. Stay in touch. I'll text when the detective is ready to meet." Rachel watched him cross the street toward the diner, his figure slightly hunched under the emotional burden they shared. Guilt tugged at her heart for delaying their appointment, for dragging him on a detour born of desperation, for seeing hope where there had been none. Yet underneath that guilt, the suspicion still burned, gnawing like a splinter too deep to pull free. She began to walk, letting the rhythm of her steps ease some of the pressure in her chest. The streets around the precinct bustled with life, business people rushing between appointments, tourists with cameras slung around their necks, children chattering as they passed by. But Rachel barely noticed them. Her thoughts were back in that church, replaying the strange embrace, the fleeting glimpse of the photo, the haunting scent of vanilla. She pulled out her phone and opened Google Maps again, scrolling back to the Street View image that had set this entire day into motion. The grainy figures stood frozen in place. One tall, one small. The pink hoodie. The man's shape, his stance, the way he tilted toward the child. The more she looked, the more certain she became. Acting on instinct, Rachel found a contact in her phone and dialed. "Melissa," she said when the other woman picked up. "It's Rachel." "Rachel? Oh my gosh, is everything okay? Did you find Eugene?" "Not yet," Rachel answered, continuing to walk, her eyes darting to each passing car. "But I need your help. Do you remember Evangelist Matthew, the one who came to Pine Hollow 2 years ago?" "Of course. The healing service was amazing. Why?" "I ran into him here in New York." "What? That's weird. Total coincidence?" "I don't think so," Rachel said. "I need you to find out everything you can about him. His background, seminary records, and church affiliations. And that woman in the wheelchair who was healed. What was her name? She filled out a visitor card, right?" "Yeah, we recorded her testimony too. I'll dig through the archives." "But what's going on?" "I'm not sure yet," Rachel admitted. "But something feels off. Call it intuition." "I'll see what I can find. Be careful, Rachel." After the call ended, Rachel slowed her pace, scanning her surroundings with renewed alertness. The architecture in this part of the city was striking. Ornate facades, old church buildings retrofitted into apartments, and public libraries with carved stone pillars. She snapped a few photos absent-mindedly with her phone. Then, across an intersection, something caught her eye. A large brick building with a sign that read Lutheran Dormitory. The structure was elegant, its windows lined with flower boxes, a sprawling green yard stretching along its side. Curious, Rachel crossed the street for a closer look. Lutheran dorms were uncommon. Usually it was Catholic institutions she encountered during her church administration work. She took another picture. Maybe she'd ask about the building's history while waiting for the detective. It would help pass the time. She had just begun to approach the entrance when a familiar car turned into the dormitory's parking lot. Rachel froze. It was Evangelist Matthew's car. But this time, he wasn't driving. Behind the wheel was the woman from the Airbnb, the same one who had packed the suitcases and helped the small blonde girl into the car earlier. Rachel ducked behind a dense shrub planted along the sidewalk, her heart pounding as she watched. The woman exited the vehicle, leaving the door ajar. The child was still in the front seat, swinging her feet back and forth. The woman stood beside the car, scanning the area as if waiting for someone. Moments later, the dormitory doors opened, and a woman in a dark habit-style uniform, a Lutheran sister perhaps, stepped outside, leading a small group of children. They ranged in age, all dressed in neat clothes. The sister guided them with gentle authority toward the car. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. What was this place? A school? A shelter? A daycare? She crouched lower behind the bush, phone in hand, camera lens ready. She snapped several discreet photos as the children approached the vehicle. She didn't see Eugene among them. But she wasn't leaving, not yet. A breeze drifted across the sidewalk, rustling the bushes and carrying faint traces of city smells. Hot concrete, distant street food, a passing scent of lavender from a nearby flower bed. Rachel crouched, barely breathing, her gaze fixed on the interaction in front of her. Why here? Why a dormitory? The woman handed a clipboard to the sister, who signed something before ushering the children forward. Rachel took another photo, then zoomed in on the car's license plate for good measure. She needed every detail she could collect. If the opportunity arose to act, she wanted proof, something more than instinct. She felt the hum of her phone in her pocket. A text from Daniel. "Detective's back. Where are you?" Rachel typed a quick reply. "Be right there, watching something. We'll explain." Her thumbs trembled as she hit send. She remained hidden a moment longer, absorbing every movement, every gesture. Her heart thundered in her chest, yet her mind felt sharply focused, alive with the sense that something pivotal was unfolding before her. This wasn't over, not even close. Each child carried a small suitcase, nearly identical to the one Rachel had seen earlier, simple, compact, worn from use. The children moved in quiet order, lining up beside the vehicle with an eerie sense of routine. The woman from the car moved with efficient calm, helping them lift their bags into the trunk as though she'd done it countless times before. Rachel's eyes scanned each of their faces, her breath catching as she counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All appeared between the ages of 7 and 12, dressed in clean but modest clothes, each with an expression of quiet resignation. And then, like a beam of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, she saw her. Eugene. The name formed in her mind even before her brain registered the full image. The girl turned slightly, laughing at something the woman said, and Rachel saw it. The profile, the delicate arch of her cheekbone. Her hair was shorter than it had been 2 years ago, but those eyes, their shape, their depth, had not changed. The small dimple on her cheek appeared when she smiled. Rachel froze, the world around her vanishing in an instant. Her vision tunneled, the sounds of the street, the rustling trees, even her own heartbeat, all vanished. For a single breathless moment, all that existed was that face. Her daughter, alive. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and called Daniel. "Rachel?" He answered immediately, his voice taut with concern. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "I found her. I found Eugene." Her knees nearly gave out as the words left her. "Get the car and come to me now." "I'm sharing my location." "What? Where are you?" "It's her, Daniel, I'm sure of it. She's with the woman from the evangelist's house. They're getting into a car. Please, please, hurry, and call the police. Right now." She ended the call, quickly shared her location, then turned her attention back to the parking lot. There was no time to wait. If that car left, Eugene might vanish again, and this time, forever. Rachel ran. Heart pounding, lungs tight, she burst from her hiding spot behind the shrubs and sprinted toward the group. "Eugene, Eugene!" she cried out, her voice breaking with urgency. The woman spotted her and reacted instantly. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she began ushering the children into the car with frenzied urgency. "Get in, now!" she ordered, slamming the trunk shut and rushing toward the driver's seat. The dormitory keeper, still standing nearby, looked on in confusion, clearly baffled by the sudden eruption of chaos. Before the woman could start the engine, Rachel reached the vehicle. She pounded on the window, her eyes locking with her daughter's in the back seat. Eugene blinked, confused at first, then her mouth opened in shock. "Mom? Is that you?" she breathed, barely louder than a whisper. Turning toward the driver's seat, Eugene asked with innocent bewilderment, "Did God make my mom alive again?" Rachel didn't wait for a response. She yanked open the back door and swept Eugene into her arms. The feel of her daughter, warm, real, solid, triggered a sob of relief so powerful that her legs nearly buckled. "It's really me, sweetheart," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "I'm alive. I've been looking for you every single day since you disappeared." The dormitory keeper rushed forward, flustered and clearly shaken. "What's happening here?" she demanded, glancing from Rachel to the children and then to the stunned woman in the driver's seat. "This is my daughter," Rachel said, her arms locked tightly around Eugene, her voice trembling. "She was kidnapped from Pine Hollow, Idaho 2 years ago. We've searched everywhere. The dormitory keeper's face went pale. Her eyes darted between Rachel and the woman. I don't understand. These children are all under Pastor Matthew's care. He told us they were orphans, part of his ministry." Before Rachel could respond, a car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the parking lot. Daniel flung open the door and sprinted across the pavement, his eyes scanning desperately. "Eugene!" he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. She turned, eyes wide. "Dad, you're alive too?" Daniel reached them and folded both Rachel and Eugene into his arms, sobbing without shame. "You found her," he whispered, holding them tightly. "You actually found her." Meanwhile, the woman in the driver's seat picked up her phone, dialing frantically, her hand shaking. Her eyes darted toward the street, perhaps looking for escape. She said something quietly, but Rachel couldn't hear over the blood pounding in her ears. She didn't need to hear it. She knew exactly who the woman was calling. "Evangelist Matthew?" The woman started the engine. Rachel barely had time to react when Daniel broke from their embrace and stormed to the front of the vehicle, slamming his fist down on the hood. "Don't you dare move this car!" he shouted. His voice thundered through the lot, drawing attention from passers-by. The wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights flashed as multiple police cruisers screeched into the lot, doors opening in unison. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Police! Everyone, stay where you are!" Daniel raised his hands immediately. "My name is Daniel Warren. That's my wife, Rachel. We just found our missing daughter, Eugene. She's been gone for 2 years. That woman," he pointed to the driver, "she's involved." Officers moved quickly. They guided the children out of the vehicle, speaking gently. The dormitory keeper stood nearby, trying to calm the frightened children, all of whom looked disoriented and scared. An officer pulled Rachel and Daniel aside, speaking in calm but firm tones. "The woman is identified as Pastor Matthew's assistant. She says the children are part of his traveling discipleship program, not his biological children." Rachel still held Eugene tightly. "She's not a student," she said fiercely. "She's my daughter, and I would bet the others are missing too. Please, check." "We will," the officer replied, nodding. "We'll verify each child's identity and health at the station." Other officers worked quickly, photographing the scene, collecting statements, and radioing for social services. Rachel barely noticed any of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the warm, trembling body in her arms. The dormitory keeper, now shaking herself, stepped forward. I had no idea," she whispered to the officers. "He told us they were from broken homes, that he was giving them a second chance." "Where is Pastor Matthew now?" one officer asked. "He's at the Airbnb," the assistant replied, her voice quavering. "He said he needed to rest before the evening service. He told me to bring Mila and the others to a place near the airport. He was going to meet us there." Rachel's heart pounded. He was planning to leave, but not anymore. Each child carried a small suitcase, nearly identical to the one Rachel had seen earlier. Simple, compact, worn from use. The children moved in quiet order, lining up beside the vehicle with an eerie sense of routine. The woman from the car moved with efficient calm, helping them lift their bags into the trunk as though she'd done it countless times before. Rachel's eyes scanned each of their faces, her breath catching as she counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All appeared between the ages of 7 and 12, dressed in clean but modest clothes, each with an expression of quiet resignation. And then, like a beam of sunlight breaking through storm clouds, she saw her. Eugene. The name formed in her mind even before her brain registered the full image. The girl turned slightly, laughing at something the woman said, and Rachel saw it. The profile, the delicate arch of her cheekbone. Her hair was shorter than it had been 2 years ago, but those eyes, their shape, their depth, had not changed. The small dimple on her cheek appeared when she smiled. Rachel froze, the world around her vanishing in an instant. Her vision tunneled. The sounds of the street, the rustling trees, even her own heartbeat, all disappeared. For a single breathless moment, all that existed was that face. Her daughter. "You'll let him live here?" With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and called Daniel. "Rachel?" He answered immediately, his voice taut with concern. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably, "I found her. I found Eugene." Her knees nearly gave out as the words left her. "Get the car and come to me now. I'm sharing my location." "What? Where are you?" "It's her, Daniel. I'm sure of it. She's with the woman from the evangelist's house. They're getting into a car. Please, please hurry. And call the police right now." She ended the call, quickly shared her location, then turned her attention back to the parking lot. There was no time to wait. If that car left, Eugene might vanish again, and this time forever. Rachel ran. Heart pounding, lungs tight, she burst from her hiding spot behind the shrubs and sprinted toward the group. "Eugene! Eugene!" she cried out, her voice breaking with urgency. The woman spotted her and reacted instantly. Her eyes widened in alarm, and she began ushering the children into the car with frenzied urgency. "Get in, now!" she ordered, slamming the trunk shut and rushing toward the driver's seat. The dormitory keeper, still standing nearby, looked on in confusion, clearly baffled by the sudden eruption of chaos. Before the woman could start the engine, Rachel reached the vehicle. She pounded on the window, her eyes locking with her daughter's in the back seat. Eugene blinked, confused at first, then her mouth opened in shock. "Mom, is that you?" she breathed, barely louder than a whisper. Turning toward the driver's seat, Eugene asked with innocent bewilderment, "Did God make my mom alive again?" Rachel didn't wait for a response. She yanked open the back door and swept Eugene into her arms. The feel of her daughter, warm, real, solid, triggered a sob of relief so powerful that her legs nearly buckled. "It's really me, sweetheart," she whispered into her daughter's hair. "I'm alive. I've been looking for you every single day since you disappeared." The dormitory keeper rushed forward, flustered and clearly shaken. "What's happening here?" she demanded, glancing from Rachel to the children and then to the stunned woman in the driver's seat. "This is my daughter," Rachel said, her arms locked tightly around Eugene, her voice trembling. "She was kidnapped from Pine Hollow, Idaho 2 years ago. We've searched everywhere." The dormitory keeper's face went pale. Her eyes darted between Rachel and the woman. I don't understand. These children are all under Pastor Matthew's care. He told us they were orphans, part of his ministry." Before Rachel could respond, a car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the parking lot. Daniel flung open the door and sprinted across the pavement, his eyes scanning desperately. "Eugene!" he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. She turned, eyes wide. "Dad? You're alive too?" Daniel reached them and folded both Rachel and Eugene into his arms, sobbing without shame. "You found her," he whispered, holding them tightly. "You actually found her." Meanwhile, the woman in the driver's seat picked up her phone, dialing frantically, her hand shaking. Her eyes darted toward the street, perhaps looking for escape. She said something quietly, but Rachel couldn't hear over the blood pounding in her ears. She didn't need to hear it. She knew exactly who the woman was calling. Evangelist Matthew. The woman started the engine. Rachel barely had time to react when Daniel broke from their embrace and stormed to the front of the vehicle, slamming his fist down on the hood. "Don't you dare move this car," he shouted. His voice thundered through the lot, drawing attention from passers-by. The wail of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Red and blue lights flashed as multiple police cruisers screeched into the lot, doors opening in unison. Officers emerged with weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Police, everyone stay where you are." Daniel raised his hands immediately. "My name is Daniel Warren. That's my wife Rachel. We just found our missing daughter Eugene. She's been gone for 2 years. That woman," he pointed to the driver, "she's involved." Officers moved quickly. They guided the children out of the vehicle, speaking gently. The dormitory keepers stood nearby, trying to calm the frightened children, all of whom looked disoriented and scared. An officer pulled Rachel and Daniel aside, speaking in calm but firm tones. "The woman is identified as Pastor Matthew's assistant. She says the children are part of his traveling discipleship program, not his biological children." Rachel still held Eugene tightly. "She's not a student," she said fiercely. She's my daughter. And I would bet the others are missing too. Please, check. We will, the officer replied, nodding. We'll verify each child's identity and health at the station. Other officers worked quickly, photographing the scene, collecting statements, and radioing for social services. Rachel barely noticed any of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the warm, trembling body in her arms. The dormitory keeper, now shaking herself, stepped forward. I had no idea, she whispered to the officers. He told us they were from broken homes, that he was giving them a second chance. Where is Pastor Matthew now? One officer asked. He's at the Airbnb, the assistant replied, her voice quivering. He said he needed to rest before the evening service. He told me to bring Mila and the others to a place near the airport. He was going to meet us there. Rachel's heart pounded. He was planning to leave, but not anymore. But manipulative predator who had preyed on the trust people placed in religious figures. He appears to have taken children while traveling between churches, the detective explained. He must have used forged credentials. We'll be investigating thoroughly. What happens now? Daniel asked, his arm protectively around Eugene. We've arrested both the man known as Evangelist Matthew, or Derek Lanton, which is his real name, and his assistant Carla Benson, Detective Morris explained. They're facing multiple charges including kidnapping, fraud, identity theft, and child endangerment. What about the other children? Rachel asked, thinking of the frightened faces she'd seen at the dormitory. We're searching databases and contacting their families, Morris assured them. They come from various states across the country, so reunification will take some time. But Eugene here is very fortunate. Her family found her. After the interviews concluded, the family remained in the quiet family room. Daniel turned to Rachel, his voice thick with remorse. I'm sorry for doubting your intuition earlier, and for calling you a false prophet, he said. Rachel smiled faintly at the memory. We shouldn't lose faith just because one priest was a bad person, she said gently. It doesn't mean all churches are corrupt. After all, it was a church that led us to finding our daughter again. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Pastor Graham stood in the doorway, his expression solemn and apologetic. I hope I'm not intruding, he said hesitantly. Detective Morris invited him in. The pastor stepped forward, hands clasped in front of him. I wanted to come personally to express how deeply sorry I am for what happened, he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. We had no idea we were harboring such evil in our midst. We've canceled tonight's service, of course. This wasn't your fault either, Pastor, Rachel said, surprising even herself with how quickly the words came. He deceived everyone. A commotion outside the family room drew their attention. Through the glass wall, they saw police escorting Matthew, Derek, in handcuffs. His eyes met Rachel's briefly, and a cold shiver traveled down her spine. His expression was hollow, devoid of remorse. As the officers walked him past, a photograph slipped from his pocket onto the ground. An officer stooped to retrieve it and brought it to Rachel. It was indeed a portrait of Eugene, along with several other children. Proof. Pastor Graham, trying to offer comfort, stepped forward again. If you're staying in the area, he said softly, I'd like to invite you to our prayer service next Sunday. Our congregation would be honored to celebrate Eugene's return with you, and perhaps your testimony might bring hope to others still searching for their loved ones. Rachel looked at Daniel. He nodded gently. We'd be honored, she replied. After all, it was a church that led us to finding our daughter again. Later that evening, they returned to their Airbnb. Eugene slept soundly between them, her breathing calm and rhythmic. It was the first time in 2 years she had slept in safety, in the embrace of her family. Rachel sat quietly, her gaze lingering on the reflection in the polished table as her thoughts wandered through the past 2 years. Every night, spent in prayer, every sleepless moment wondering where Eugene was, had led to this point. The relief was immense, yet the burden of what could have been still weighed heavily on her heart. Outside the window, dusk was falling. Streetlights flickered to life, casting elongated shadows across the pavement. The day's emotional weight pressed down, but within the family room, a fragile peace had begun to form. A sanctuary carved out of chaos. Daniel, who rarely showed emotion so openly, still hadn't let go of Rachel's hand. He kept glancing at Eugene as if needing constant confirmation that she was truly there, truly alive. For so long she had existed only in photos, memories, and dreams. Now she was a breathing presence between them. Detective Morris returned briefly to provide updates. The investigation was growing, with authorities from several states being contacted to cross-reference missing child cases. Each lead had the potential to reunite another family, though it was clear this process would take time and care. Rachel offered to help. She had years of administrative experience through her church, and the detective gladly accepted her support in organizing data for the growing case. Being useful, being part of the healing process for others, gave Rachel a new sense of purpose. As evening deepened, Pastor Graham returned with care packages from his congregation, blankets, snacks, and children's books for Eugene and the other kids. He expressed a desire to start a support group for families impacted by child disappearance and religious exploitation. Rachel commended his initiative, thankful that out of darkness, light was beginning to shine. Daniel leaned over and whispered to Rachel, "When we get back home, we should host a community night, not just about Eugene, but for every parent who's still waiting for their child to return." Rachel nodded, her eyes misting. "Yes, we have to share this miracle. If it gives even one parent the strength to keep going, it will be worth it." In the corner, Eugene was coloring quietly, content, safe, and surrounded by love for the first time in years. The sight nearly undid Rachel all over again. She turned to Daniel and said, "No more waiting rooms. No more looking at maps or chasing shadows. We're home now, all three of us." Daniel kissed her forehead. "Yes, we are." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel allowed herself to believe that everything might be okay.